welcome to the Center for Global Humanities. For those of you who didn't attend our lecture on Friday, this is our 8th year in operation. Some of you have been with us since year 1, and you know who you are, and I thank you for being such loyal participants and supporters of the center. We need this kind of center in the state of Maine. We need this center globally because of the kinds of lectures, discussions we have here, and which illuminate the condition of the world today. We always invite people to ask questions, to engage in discussion. We used to have a tagline, engaging the world. I don't know whether it's still here today, but that is the spirit of the Center for Global Humanities. And I also thank you for coming tonight, because I know it's a special night, and I know you have something to do at 9 p.m. So do we. The speaker too, by the way, she cannot wait. So it's all planned. Everybody's going to be somewhere at 9 p.m., except I just met a few students who are absolutely not interested in the debate. They have a lot of homework to do. They're in the College of Dentistry, which says a lot about our new College of Dentistry. So I need to thank a lot of people because we are starting this semester on this campus, or this season on campus. Some of them are behind the booth over there, Dave Diego and Lee. They've been very supportive with the technology. Liz Bennett, she's practically now running the center and everything associated with it. We have a lot of colleagues in communications who are here with us. Crystal Kenny, she does a lot of the public relations and communications and a lot of other things besides. And Jonathan Santos does the web. Jen Swanda here, she's a new colleague who just joined us recently. You are going to see more of her in this center and other places at the university. What am I missing? Well, Jeff Shea is always here. The guy, the photographer. How long have you been with us? 7 years. So we do have a loyal following, as you know. Occasionally, my wife joins me too, and she's in the back, Melissa. Some of you may have never met her, but she's there too. And colleagues here as well, students and everybody else. I am very delighted that, Sandy, of course. I didn't see Sandy. She's back from Morocco. And Josh Pahigian is there, and Emily Dragon is there. So many. So Emily Dragon is our director of the Global Education Program, and Josh Pahigian, for those who don't know him yet, he is he teaches our students. This is a seminar. He teaches the seminar to students who take it, and there are 4 students who are taking it this semester. They're very brave. They decided to do all the reading and do all the writing, which is a lot to their credit. So congratulations to those students who took on the challenge to read all these books and participate in these discussions. Well, we don't have a lot of time. The lecture is going to be limited to about 45 minutes, and we'll take about 4 questions afterwards because people need to leave. And so this is going to be a special and condensed but very highly interesting and illuminating discussion. So the topic today is Muslim fashion and global politics. And the presenter, we are very lucky to have this distinguished presenter, globally renowned on this topic, and she speaks all over the globe. She is the ArtsCom Centenary Professor of Cultural Studies at London College of Fashion, University of the Arts in London. She is the author of Muslim Fashion, Contemporary Style Cultures, which was published by Duke University Press in 2015, Rethinking Orientalism, Women, Travel, and the Ottoman Harem, 2004, Gender in Orientalism, Race, Femininity, and Representation in '96, and Gender in, and she's also the editor of Modern Fashion, Styling, Bodies, Mediating Faith, published in 2013, and with Nancy Micklewright of Gender, Modernity, and Liberty, Middle Eastern and Western Women's Writings, a critical reader, published in 2006, and with Sarah Mills of Feminist Post-Colonial Theory, a reader, published in 2003, and with Peter Horn of Outlooks, Lesbian and Gay Visual Cultures, published in 1996. Reina Lewis is also editor with Elizabeth Wilson of the book series Dress Cultures, and with Teresa Hefferman of the book series Cultures in Dialogue. Reina is a frequent media commentator, most recently for the New York Times, Le Monde, BBC World, BBC Radio, CBC Radio, The Guardian, The Times, Marie Claire Magazine, Elle Brazil, etc., Fortune.com, and Huffington Post. She is also convenes a public talk series, Faith and Fashion, at the London College of Fashion. So please help me welcome Reina Lewis to the podium.
Well, thank you, Anouar. That was a wonderful welcome. And as you all know, this evening I am Hillary's warm-up. I don't really want to be Trump's warm-up. That just sounds too gross. So I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, and I've prepared this as a sort of semi-formal lecture so that I can stop myself going on for too long. But I'll be very happy to respond to questions and discussion afterwards. And if there's anything I'm saying that you really don't understand or that doesn't make sense, just give me a shout, and I'll be happy to go over it. So I would like to thank Anouar Majid, Professor Anouar Majid, for his kind invitation, the Center for Global Humanities here at the University of New England for their generous hospitality, and also Elizabeth Bennett for all her help in getting me here. As you heard, I run a talk series in London called Faith and Fashion. We run one event a term. You're very welcome to sign up for mailings about that and the podcast. If you're ever in London, you're so welcome to come, but I have to warn you, our reception is not as fancy as this one. I have to go back and speak to the caterers and get a better budget because I have been put to shame. So eat before you come when you come to my events. Can you hear me okay? So people at the back wave if I fade away. I know that some of you have had a look at my recent book, Muslim Fashion, for which thank you very much. And I'm going to be sharing with you today some of my new work that builds on that project. So we meet tonight at a moment when the mainstream fashion industry is suddenly awash with marketing aimed at Muslims and even some products designed for Muslims. Yet Muslim clothing continues to be viewed as inherently political. Now, as you won't all have read the book or know my previous work, I'm going to start by explaining briefly how I came to be researching in this area. And my paper today is very much ideas in progress. So I'm trying stuff out on you, and I'll be very thankful and grateful for your response. And I think it would be helpful, therefore, to give you a quick sense, a quick sketch of the intellectual and political hinterland that preceded it. So the first thing to say here at the Center for Global Humanities is that I started off very firmly in the humanities with a training in fine art, art history, English, and cultural history. Because when you say to people that you meet that you work at London College of Fashion, they step back and they do this. And they look you up and down, and I say very quickly, no, I don't make anything. I write about the people that do, and I write about the people that write about the fashion. My previous work focused on Western imperial cultures and Orientalism in the fine arts and in literature. I researched how Western gendered identities were racialized and how religious and religio-ethnic identities were mobilized by elite Ottoman women writers in a bid for social emancipation that simultaneously challenged Western stereotypes. In other words, I wrote about dead authors and their books, and dead artists and their paintings. All of it concerned with Orientalism, gender, cultural power, and imperialism in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So how come contemporary material and why fashion? Well, after 9/11, I found that the media was full of images of Muslim women that seemed to reproduce so many of the Orientalist stereotypes that I had been studying in elite and middle-brow cultural forms from the past 2 centuries. Whilst a securitizing discourse was picturing Islam and Muslims as outside of so-called Western civilization, I could see that the streets were full of cool young Muslim women styling headscarves or hijab from the British high street, from the mall. But these style creations were conspicuously absent from celebrations of British street style. This absence mattered because many young Muslim women were specifically using fashion to communicate to external observers that they were part of British society. Now, I don't think consumer culture will bring about world peace. But I do know that people from the majority culture often can't imagine how hurtful and alienating it is to feel disregarded by the prevalent cultural forms of the society in which you live. And consumer culture and fashion is one of the predominant cultural forms that surrounds us. A growing number of young women in the last 15 to 20 years has adopted the hijab and other forms of modest dressing as central to the cultivation and expression of pious dispositions. For them, the commodities of globalized consumer cultures have been essential tools in their construction of religiously related fusion fashion. In this, they differ from the first waves of women who adopted the hijab during the global Islamic revival of the 1950s and 70s, in which home-sewn plain dress was valued by some in the piety movement as an alternative to Western consumer culture. Today's young generation are using the global trends of mainstream fashion to create style distinction from their elders and to forge links with their peers. My research over the last 10 years has focused on religiously related modest dressing amongst Muslims and among Christian, Jewish, and other faith groups. I've looked especially at the development of a niche market for modest fashion in online retail and the lively blogosphere that has grown to accompany it. And when I talk about blogs or the blogosphere, I also mean all contemporary forms of social media. This is a largely woman-led sphere of commercial activity and online commentary. Young women are developing and disseminating new forms of religious practice by combining religious commitment and minority community participation with the quotidian trends of mainstream fashion. I don't think we should regard fashion developments as trivial. Rather, I recommend that they be taken seriously as forms of religious knowledge creation and transmission. These forms have the power to influence individual and collective understandings about the relationship of religious and religio-ethnic communities and society. As we know, fashion operates as a form of communication. Women consciously dress fashionably in their Muslim headscarf or their Jewish shaitel, their wig, to demonstrate to onlookers that they are part of contemporary modernity. But how they dress, how anyone dresses, is interpreted and judged in different ways by different observers. Women who choose to dress modestly in relation to their understanding of their faith face surveillance and regulation from within their faith communities, and they face stereotype and prejudice from without. So when I talk today about the role of dress in women's social, employment, and political participation, I want to bear in mind the polysemic nature of dress as a form of visual communication. Garments don't have fixed meaning in and of themselves. Our dressed appearance can mean many different things to those who view us. So the example I normally give is, I go into work to lecture to my students. I think I'm looking really cool. They're probably thinking, oh my God. And they're kind enough not to say so. And I must say, when I was at the school this morning, and one of the students started off by saying, I really like your jacket. Could you see me preen with pride? I was like, I've made it. A 16-year-old rates my clothes. In relation to Muslim women's dress, and especially in relation to the stigmatizing effects of looking Muslim post 9/11, it becomes crucially important to think about how the visibly Muslim body differently registers to the diverse audiences that encounter her as she moves through the course of her day and the course of her life. Now, I want to see if and how the first generation of modest fashion practitioners may move into position of influence. I've spent the past 10 years studying what we might think of as the pioneering cohort of modest fashion dressers, young women who were then 18 to 28, who led the way as designers, creative entrepreneurs, bloggers, journalists, fashion photographers, and consumers in the formation of commerce and community in the niche of modest fashion. So this group are now 28, 38, early 40s, and there's a new generation of teenagers and 20-somethings. So I'm interested in how this cohort take modest dressing with them as they move through their life phases. This includes the many variations that I see already, including, for example, Muslim women who choose to stop wearing hijab whilst continuing with other forms of modest presentation. Or the numbers of young-ish modern Orthodox Jewish women who maybe chose to cover their heads when they got married, often whose mothers didn't, and who now, several years on, are stopping doing that, but are still dressing in ways that meet their understanding and their changing understanding of modesty. These women are often the progressive wing, and I know progressive is a difficult word, of conservative religious communities. And they face internal challenges from the growing power of the religious rights, plural. So it's especially important to recognize if and how fashion can be a conduit for social change. Providing garments and style advice to meet the needs of women who dress modestly for any reason, the modest fashion community has emerged as a field of commerce and commentary. Young women's voices are being heard in this field. Participating in what some like to term a cross-faith modesty movement, women are talking to their co-religionists and to women from different faith and secular backgrounds. And they're discussing things that go far beyond what people might imagine to be the narrow preoccupation of fashion. And let me just define what I mean for a moment by modest fashion. I use the term modest fashion to refer to the many different ways in which women use clothing to achieve a form of public presentation that meets their understanding of their faith's requirements about modesty. The holy texts of many faiths concern themselves with modest covering and behavior of women's and men's bodies. These rules are interpreted in different ways, varying across time and place, and are filtered through community convention and custom. The internet, of course, has been essential to the development of modest fashion commerce and commentary. So far, however, academic studies of religion online, especially of Islam online, have tended to focus on masculinist jihadi communications. Modest fashion cross-faith follows a similar pattern of lateral knowledge creation and transmission, but modest fashion is led by women and advocates selective engagement with, rather than repudiation of, the external, secular, and commercial world. The internet allows criticism as much as dialogue. Social media developments have increased the volume and ferocity of criticism, and some commentators and designers have left the field because of that. As you can tell, my research combines humanities-based textual analysis with ethnographic style interviews and site observation. And these fields are all approached through the lens of the sociology of religion. This mix helps me capture and analyze the nuance and change in modest fashion. If we're to get beyond essentializing stereotypes and learn to combat prejudice, we must find ways to understand that how we present ourselves in the world and how we experience others is likely to be marked by contradiction and change. This center is committed to enhancing the contribution of the humanities to understanding the contemporary world. And I note that my cross-disciplinary work remains underpinned by a humanities commitment to the historicized analysis of representation and material culture. Now, this can make for challenging conversations in the classroom and in public, as at my Faith and Fashion Talk series. So as well as teaching in this area and supervising grad students, I also feed into staff development for faculty and professional services at the university. Here, as in the classroom, I find that many are fearful of getting it wrong, of offending someone's religious belief, a sort of cultural cringe that parallels the anxieties about race and ethnicity with which many of us are long familiar. And to this I say, it is our responsibility as educators to tackle difficult subjects. We must allow students and colleagues and the public to be fully present with all elements of their history and background in the learning environment. This is essential if we are to foster an atmosphere of critical engagement based on mutual respect. There are no positions of moral purity, and the going can be tough, but also it can be done. In the classroom, for example, I may often encounter a person of faith declaring with conviction that this is what the Quran or the Bible requires. And my response is always to say that I work from a position of multiple interpretations and regard the holy texts as mediated cultural artifacts. Even if someone considers the holy text to be the revealed word of God, we can still look at the different uses made of them in different times and locations. I'm not teaching theology. I consider it my responsibility as the educator or facilitator to voice this approach. And I do this also so that co-religionists, especially in the classroom, are able to express differing opinions without fear of being shamed as bad Jews or bad Muslims. Maintaining a position of respect for diverse interpretations and practices is sometimes challenging for educators, just as it can be for community members. And this is where the humanities can be so helpful in supporting the right to critical engagement. Holding differing opinions doesn't mean disrespecting someone, and it's important to develop skills of careful argumentation and the ability to cope with dissent in the classroom, in research, and in life. And we'll all be watching the debate tonight to see how well they do with that. So why do I think that Muslim women and other modest fashion participants are influencers? Most modest fashion participants I studied would specifically avoid claiming a position of religious authority. But they are aware that their behaviors and words are evaluated as exemplary, and they do regard themselves as having the responsibilities and opportunities of being role models. I respect why many women do not wish to be constrained by the formal rank of religious or community leader. And I contend that the activities surrounding and producing modest fashion can be seen as forms of religious practice that have acquired authoritative status. And this is Winnie Detwa, Nadia Azmi, who blogs as Winnie Detwa, both in and out of hijab. And she wrote very interestingly online about her decision to stop wearing hijab. And I've written elsewhere about how she dealt with the responses to that. Outside the often hierarchical structures of institutional religion, modest fashion discourse and practice is a new mode of religious knowledge production. It's transmitted through peer-to-peer channels. And this is in part fueled by a generational affiliation to the Ummah, the supranational community of Muslim believers. And this often takes part in a dynamic relationship to Muslim community norms of family and region. And it has been central to the development of Islamic and Islamist politics. An attachment to the Ummah has also been central to new forms of Islamic consumer culture. Yet modest fashion so far has remained largely under the radar of government actors seeking access to influence religious and religio-ethnic populations and minorities. So I advocate that researchers and policymakers learn to look at fashion as a conduit into wider discussions with and between diverse communities. Globally youthful and growing in countries regarded as emerging markets for neoliberal consumer capitalism, the Muslim demographic has been identified as a key target by marketers in many fields. The growing Muslim fashion scene is now leading the Islamic branding sector away from its initial focus on food and finance into lifestyle and related products and services. The global Muslim spend on all apparel, not just modest clothing, was valued at $224 billion in 2012. And it is projected to double, more than double, to $488 billion by 2019. So you can see why the global brands want to get to these consumers. So I'd spent 10 years researching for my book, hearing about how the mainstream brands were ignoring Muslim consumers. So you give in your manuscript, it takes forever for it to come out, and just as it was coming out, 2014 saw the first foray into fashion from mainstream brands, with DKNY marketing a Ramadan capsule collection in the Gulf, at the bottom here, modeled by brand ambassador Tamara Al-Gabani, who is herself a Dubai-based designer and media celebrity. And this was followed in 2015 at the top by Uniqlo's collaboration with British Muslim designer Hannah Tajima, and again in 2016. In identifying Muslims as a previously underexploited market segment, brands and marketing professionals are not simply attending to a priori previously existing social segment that they had been neglecting. They are actively creating it, rendering religious dispositions into potential constituent elements of what Nicholas Rose has termed the choosing subject of liberal capitalism. Different women interpret the requirement to dress modestly in different ways. In a context where Orientalist and civilizational stereotypes continue to regard veiling as a sign of essentialized Muslim patriarchal oppression, many women assert their choice to veil as the definitive evidence of Muslim female agency. Now, I find sociological theories of everyday religion very helpful in understanding this. Methodologies from the sociology of religion help me to emphasize the permeability of divisions between religious denominations, between the sacred and the profane, between religious and spiritual, and most of all to understand how religious and spiritual practice is forged through not uncritical interaction with the market. Characterized by blending syncretism and contradiction, as Maguire explains, at the level of the individual, religion is not fixed, unitary, or even necessarily coherent. The pioneering cohort of Muslim fashionistas growing up in Muslim minority contexts are often second and third and now even fourth generation migrants. Rather than being forced to cover by their parents or their husbands, many have mothers who don't cover their heads or who maybe do so more habitually rather than doctrinally. In crafting their own version of Islam and expressing it through revivalist lifestyle cultures, young Muslim women and men share with their non-Muslim peers a project of self-actualization through personal spiritual quest. So there is a general increase in religiosity amongst the under 30s and the under 35s. It might be that group who say that they are spiritual but not religious. It's not necessarily about attachment to firm denomination or about going to church or synagogue. It's about having a sense of spirituality in the world. These developmental journeys are often forged in relationship to, rather than rejection of, the market. So these young women don't rely on so-called ethnic clothing of community convention, such as saris or shalwar kameez. Characteristically, they forged new modes of modest fashion through participation in mainstream consumer cultures. They've grown up with world music, world food, world fashion. So young millennial Muslims, assisted by the internet, can blend new forms of Islamic lifestyle from a global mood board of present and past pan-Islamic inspiration. The prevalence of choice, rather than adherence to prevailing community custom, is a way of legitimating forms of religious practice and modes of identification, which demonstrate that Muslim identities are being staged not only as inherited and ascribed collectively by birth, but also as individuated and voluntary. So the idea of religious identity as achieved through personal confessional practice relates to a model of religious identity that is usually regarded within a Western Christian-centric worldview, an inheritance of the European Protestant Reformation. So Christians might forge through confession their individual relationship to God. For most Jews, birth confirms membership of the faith. For Muslims, faith can be both ascribed through birth, sufficient for some, and achieved, welcomed in a religion that is proselytizing and that welcomes converts. Now, this attempt, this understanding of the personal religious self as something that is individually achieved is typical of what some commentators like Olivier Roy call global Islam, or for Niloufar Golay, European Islam, approaches that consciously seek to frame Muslim identities and Islamic practices suitable for a modern and multi-faith, multicultural world that is often experienced in a Muslim minority context. Now, the discourse of choice is supported, as Leila Ahmed argues, by the conceptualization of liberal ideas of equality and human rights as intrinsic to Islam, rather than as external. Some theorists characterize Islamist groups as new social movements. So like Occupy, the living out of the desired collective values in the now is an end in itself. And again, this is where many of these young people have a lot in common with their peers of their age from all sorts of religious and secular backgrounds. Many Muslims involved in modest fashion see themselves as part of a practice that crosses between faiths and between faith and secular divides, keen to sell to consumers from without as well as within their faith bracket. Now, in Britain, Muslim designer Sarah El-Anani crossed into multi-faith commerce when she was contacted to design uniform items for the British Girl Scouts. You have the guides and the Scouts over here? Yeah? So she told me, this is what she said, the thing I love about it the most is that it's really positive for the British-Muslim relationship because British Muslims are very angsty with a huge chip on their shoulder and they think everyone's against them. I hope this shows them that they're not. I think it's really positive in that sense, which is great because that's what scouting is supposed to do. Now, the commission arose because of increased Muslim participation in what has been historically a Christian and sometimes evangelical youth movement. So the Scouts is really trying to change. And Sarah told me there are some Scouts groups starting up particularly in Muslim-populated East London, and they were having to create their own customized stuff, the usual Muslim story. So the Scouts' formal uniform, I don't know, who here was a Scout or a Guide or a Brownie? Okay, cool. So the Scouts' formal uniform was a long-sleeve button-up shirt. This was okay. The problem was when you went to camp or you did outdoor activities and it was a polo shirt with short sleeves and that wasn't so long in the back. So this posed a problem, but not just for the Muslim girls. So her client at the Scouts who commissioned her had explained when commissioning her that, quote, our non-Muslim regular Scout explorers, the 14 to 18-year-olds, they're always complaining about the uniform, saying it rides up my back. You can see my bum when I bend over. I'm not comfortable. I'm exposed. Sarah's designs, therefore, were recruited ostensibly to serve Muslim members, but they were made economically more viable by cross-faith and secular modesty needs. And on the Scouts web store, the garments were promoted as part of the non-denominational iScout, i.scout, supplementary product range. And the website trumpeted the clothes as modest and comfortable, with extended sleeves and deep pockets, handy when on camp. The press-worthy collaboration provided added value to the Scouts' multi-faith and multi-ethnic participation strategy. Outside of fashion, fashion commentary has provided young women with routes to community ambassadorship through interfaith activity. So Jana Kosabayati, who started one of the first Muslim fashion blogs, Hijab Style, started it when she was a teenager doing her A-levels before university, and her parents were worried that doing the blog would distract her from her exams and that she wouldn't do well. Well, by the time she graduated as a doctor, they got over worrying about that, and they were actually really proud of the opportunities that it brought her. So she was starting to do her work in hospital, and she didn't know if she'd have time to continue with the blog. And her mom was really encouraging her because she said it gave her such great opportunity to represent young Muslims, to be ambassador for youth projects, and also to support charities. So they said that it was a good life experience. Sarah Joseph, who was the editor of ML print magazine, now out of print, had a platform on national media. She was a regular contributor to the BBC Radio 2 spiritual slot, Pause for Thought. Now, Sarah was a convert to Islam, and as an educated white British convert, she only became a minority through conversion. So she had a very interesting perspective. And she was especially frustrated, she said, by, quote, the current discourse when they say to young Muslims, do you belong? Are you British? You can be both simultaneously, and it's all about loyalty. At ML, we try to instill amongst everybody that it's about the 4 C's: confidence, contribution, common good, and connectivity. In Britain, interfaith activity was at one point ad hoc, and it's now formalized and diversified. Begun with often bilateral organizations set up between Christians and Jews in the 1940s, the interfaith sector now includes other religions in response to changes in migration and perceived social and political needs. In North America, the events of 9/11 made the need for dialogue between Christians and Muslims feel more urgent. Though, as Jane Smith has observed, for much of the 2000s, American theologians remained, she says, significantly behind their British and continental colleagues in finding ways to think interfaith. In the United States, the situation wasn't helped by the tendency of some Christian evangelicals to regard America itself as a new mission field for the conversion of Muslims. So sensitivities remain about the need to maintain religious distinction, plus the theological challenges of which religions can be considered to provide a route to salvation. Many prefer to take ethical rather than theological dialogue as the basis for connection between communities. Although women have historically been less involved in interfaith dialogue, the push for dialogue has often come from liberals, but it's often been the case that dialogue partner representatives reproduce internal hierarchies of gender and age. So you might find a very liberal church reaching out to very conservative Jewish or Muslim male elders to be the community representative rather than women. And this is also true, of course, as Wadud makes clear, in terms of class and ethnicity. And I'm showing here some pics from the fabulous Twitter pages this year, Blackout Eid, with Black Muslims using visuals and text to challenge the marginalization of African and African American Muslims. Linda Woodhead suggests that we are now seeing a change in which as religious actors return to welfare and education provision in Britain, interfaith and faith practice is increasingly marketized and mediatized, within, she says, a logic of consumer capitalism rather than national state bureaucracy. And this marketized and mediatized approach to religion is typical of Muslim and modest fashion. Reaching out to consumers from other communities is more than just good business sense for entrepreneurs in the modest fashion industry. As with bloggers and journalists, they share a mission to validate and encourage women in practices of modest dressing. Whilst all interfaith dialogue can be fraught, there is considerable evidence that modest fashion has the potential to open fruitful relationships on and offline. However, participants need to be alert to risk. Modest fashion inhabits an unpredictable politicized field in which definitions of desirable partners can be repositioned by shifting intra- and inter-religious debates. Some of you may know this example. When designers and mediators do collaborate across faith, it may be dissent from co-religionists that causes problems. In July 2014, New York Orthodox designers Mimu Maxi, that was the brand, teamed up with Muslim blogger Summer Al-Barker. So they gave her one of their maxi skirts to feature in a selfie on her website, her Instagram site, Hipster Hijabi. And not all their Jewish followers shared their celebration of cross-faith modest fashion commonality. As events in Gaza that year reached critical proportions, brand owners Mimi Hecht and Mushti Notik were flamed with criticism online that it was insensitive, to some traitorous, to show a Muslim woman in hijab on a Jewish website when co-religionists, for some family members in Israel, were seen to be under attack. They took a lot of criticism. Now, they faced down threats of a boycott from some of their Jewish customer base, and they stayed resolute. So Mimi and Mushti posted a response to their Orthodox critics on Facebook, and they positioned the shared promotion of modesty as a mitzvah, a Jewish value. They mobilized advice from Orthodox rabbis to remind Jews that they should embrace chances to promote modesty, they said, amongst all the women of the world. The further and most foreign the reach, the better. They added that on a soul level, this is the best time, because this kind of collaboration and awareness is a huge component in fighting ignorance and hatred towards Jews. So it's really interesting that faced with risk, and they were running a business, they did not suppress the debate. They told the Village Voice that, quote, our followers and customers are entitled to have a voice. And Summer Al-Barker, the blogger who had prior experience of interfaith initiatives, also held firm, maintaining, she said, that I wouldn't blame or tie my friends in the Jewish community to the tragedies in Israel and Palestine. To return to my case, for the social and political significance of modest fashion, we see that modest fashion brings women's voices to a wider and wider audience on and offline. Governments, I think, should listen to the content of what they are saying and recognize the potential of their communication networks for the dissemination of other messages. If progressives like these face less misunderstanding and prejudice from external mainstream society, it will support them in standing up to oppressive forces within their community. Modest fashion influence extends offline. Fashion shows combine catwalk with community, providing motivational speakers, offering employment and education advice. So I think this pioneering cohort will continue to be influencers. And as they grow through young adulthood, they will bring their skill sets in values, communications, and connections into new roles in work, community, politics, and family. Muslim women made prominent through fashion or simply as hijabis feel keenly a responsibility to represent their religious and ethnic communities. Do any of you watch Great British Bake Off, the BBC show? So some of you will remember Nadia Hussain, who rose to fame in the UK when she won the show in 2015. And that same year, 23-year-old Londoner Maria Idrissi shot to fame as a hijabi after she appeared in H&M's Close the Loop recycling film. And this went viral within minutes. The H&M wanted to have a campaign for recycling that included social diversity. So they had models who had a prosthetic leg, and for the first time, and they had models of different visible ethnic and racial difference, but it was the first time that we'd seen visible religious difference used as part of a social diversity fashion campaign. And I thought that was incredibly interesting. And Maria, who's an English graduate who'd just taken up working with her cousin, they have a beauty salon, was also motivated to do it because it was a fashion campaign about recycling. So the sustainable message was important to her. She got more attention than any of the other models. It went absolutely viral in the Muslim blogosphere, and then in Muslim-majority news outlets, and then in the mainstream fashion zone, and then in the mainstream news zone. So this is a story where fashion became a conduit for telling a much bigger story. Now, for Maria Idrissi, as also for Tamara Al-Gabani in the DKNY campaign in the Emirates, the rapid raise in their profile. She went from 800 to about 23,000 followers on Instagram within days. Was also seen as an opportunity to parlay fashion status into a social good. So for Tamara, it was partly in challenging gender norms in Muslim-majority Middle East, and for Maria, in challenging prejudice about Muslims in the Muslim-minority West. So Maria has worked with the police on youth initiatives with youngsters. She's done a TEDx teen talk, and she's appeared at fashion events and at schools and community events. And she sees her new profile as a chance, she says, to be subliminally giving dawah, teaching about hijab. Now, dawah, literally the obligation to guide Muslims to greater piety, can also include providing guidance about the faith to non-Muslims. A sort of women's mission to women has emerged regarding hijab. Now, this can sometimes be encountered as oppressive, with some women promoting a progressivist narrative of ever stricter covering. But within the modest fashion movement, majority opinion emphasizes respect for women's choice in degree and range of covering and style, including women who do not cover their heads. So this is Maria. We were on a panel together at a girls' school in a Muslim-majority part of East London, and it was very clear that for her and the other bloggers, it was an opportunity to say to the Muslim girls, if you want to wear hijab, you can. Don't let it stop you doing anything. But also to the external world and to the non-Muslim girls and teachers to say, and don't assume that the hijab is the thing that defines these young women, or that they are necessarily having it imposed on them. Tamara also found similar opportunities to be a role model to the younger community there in the Gulf. As in other fields, informal and formal affiliations can be supportive and regulatory. In the modest fashion field, dress may be used to teach women exemplary behavior, which is then policed by social pressure. However, as Asra Kunamani and Hala Arafa argued recently in the Washington Post, we should also be careful about the language we use in academic and media outlets. So they want us to stop referring to the headscarf as hijab. They say it's not just a translation of the word. They trace the etymology of the term hijab from the Quran and the Hadiths, the holy texts of Islam, to argue that hijab has never simply meant headscarf. So they empty the term of its apparent neutrality and reclassify hijab as a descriptor that has been mobilized by repressive forms of Islam in Saudi Arabia and Iran. These approaches, they contend, seek to promote head covering as a virtual sixth pillar in addition to the 5 pillars of Islam, the obligatory behaviors and acts, in order to normatize it as a required practice for Muslim women. This, they say, has real-life effects. They argue today in the 21st century, most mosques around the world, including in the United States, deny us, as Muslim women, our Islamic right to pray without a headscarf, discriminating against us by refusing us entry if we don't cover our hair. They ask well-meaning supporters of Muslim women's rights not to use the term hijab. Don't use that word, they say. They propose that feminists should support Muslim women in the pursuit of rights to cover or not cover, and for full participation in religious spaces, practices, and politics. Now, many feminists, Muslim and non-Muslim, do indeed take this approach, but it may be that in framing the argument about choice in religio-cultural expression through the language of hijab does serve unwittingly to promulgate a worldview that is not gender inclusive or egalitarian. Now, the fact that many of the young women who've spoken to me of their hijab fashions may themselves be unaware of this argument about terminology is precisely the point. The use of language has discursive effects on individuals within and without a given community. So this debate is for me a timely reminder that the academic researcher is herself part of the discursive construction of values and judgments. Terms that seem or seemed to be preferable for their ability to be inclusive or non-judgmental may take on new valences in new circumstances or when used with different audiences, a familiar dilemma for all of us concerned with global humanities. In face of constant challenges to the authenticity or intent or rendition of modesty, I agree with Carla Jones's call to recognize, she says, the ambivalences within Islamic consumer practice. She writes, power relations, transnational, national, and especially those classed and gendered, influence which categories of consumption can be framed as virtuous and which cannot. In this context, Muslim women's battles to define and defend their plural understandings of Muslim practice are waged as much and as constantly against the forces of conservatism within their religious communities as they are fought against external prejudice externally. In the securitized post-9/11 context, I agree with Claire Alexander that, she quotes, "It may be possible to argue that as the color line was for the early 20th century, the Muslim question has become the defining issue of our times. Clothing and body management, veils and beards now augment and sometimes replace skin color as key signifiers of alterity." With the Muslim Council of Britain launching a report to celebrate the power of the Muslim pound, the Muslim dollar, it's worth remembering the political importance of allowing for ambiguity. Participants in today's subcultures of Muslim modest fashion may find themselves rapidly positioned by what are to some the unexpected consequences of commodification. Filed under "Be careful what you wish for," Muslim consumers may want to consider lessons learned in the queer community. If poorer queers find themselves priced out of pride now that venues are run by commerce rather than by community, will Muslim women find that wearing hijab has become the price of entry to the new cool halal cafe? As this research progresses, I shall be tracking if modest fashion activities create a stage for these young and now youngish women to be recognized as influencers whose reach goes beyond style into politics, community, and employability. But be aware, please, that status within the modest fashion community depends on spiritual and political integrity as well as on style smarts. To work with a cohort committed to defending women's rights to choose if and how to cover. So many young women will say it is just as wrong to force someone to uncover, as they've attempted in France or in Quebec, as it is to force someone to cover, as in Iran or Saudi Arabia or in some local communities. If it's not freely chosen, it's not an authentic expression. To work with a cohort committed to defending, therefore, women's rights to choose if and how to cover, researchers, third sector, and government actors must build connections based on trust that don't imperil the reputation of those whose influence they seek. I know that some from consciously religious backgrounds balk at commodifying religious dispositions for the market. so too do some committed to a secular frame for academic studies find it hard to give credence to religion and belief. Personally, I'm excited to see what avenues can be opened up as we move forward in integrating religion, faith, and spirituality into the critical humanities framework. Thank you.
We'll take a few questions. There are microphones on both sides. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and someone will give you a microphone.
Oh, we have a question right here from a Greeley Middle School teacher, I think.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm wondering, as an ethnographer, how you think your positionality as a person, I'm assuming not in the faith community of Muslim, how that influences your research and how you make sure you keep the Muslim voices at the forefront of your research.
That's a great question, and it's really important. So we all know, the idea that you could be the sort of the neutral Western observer who can just, go into the village, we said this earlier, go into the village, go into the community and observe as if you being there has no impact at all. We know that's gone. We've all taken the cultural turn in ethnography. We've read Cliff and Geertz and Clifford. One of the things that I discovered when I would approach designers or bloggers or entrepreneurs, that I would write an email that would say, dear blah, we haven't met. I'm from the London College of Fashion and I'm doing this research project on. And the email got longer and longer as I started to incorporate some of the frequently asked questions. I would start to incorporate an answer. So I would make clear that I'm not Muslim, because with a name like Reina, I could potentially be so, that I'm not Muslim. And people would say, are you hostile? Are you against hijab? And I would say, no, I'm not against hijab, but neither am I promoting it. I notice that there's this very interesting thing happening, and I think it merits serious scholarly attention, and it merits attention within the frame of fashion. I would always make clear that I wasn't Muslim, and then I would disclose further things about myself as that came up in the conversation where it was relevant. And one of the things I say in the introduction to the book, where I talk about this a little bit more, was that actually having grown up Jewish was quite useful because I had the experience of growing up white, but also as part of a religio-ethnic minority. So some of the experiences about being a minority culture made sense to me because I could relate to that as well. I think it's very important to try and find a way, as Gayatri Spivak says, of speaking with, not speaking for. I'm paraphrasing. And that's often very difficult, and especially when I go and I give a lot of talks to different community groups and so on, it can be very hard. And I think that's where I draw the parallel with previous work that I've done, that many of us have done in anti-racist education and anti-racist education initiatives, which is to say it is also the responsibility of the white folk to challenge racism, and it's the responsibility of the non-Muslims to speak out and challenge discrimination against Muslims. And that's also why I really emphasize that I take a position of plurality, because I don't want to be saying, yes, this is the right way to wear hijab. I don't even want to be saying you should or must be wearing hijab. And I try to give as much information as I can, so my emails are now like going on for pages, so that people can decide if they don't want to speak to me. I don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable. So that's the way that I've dealt with that. But I've faced some very tough challenges as well. It can be really delicate.
I think we have another question right here.
Hi.
Hi, thank you very much for the really nice talk. I found it very interesting when you almost equated the hijab and the Muslim dress code to being a minority of color. And that is a huge thing because from my personal experience, I really wore my hijab after 9/11. Before that, I never wore it. And it was built upon my total conviction of that I should wear it because I started reading about my religion deeply, and that I was convinced that I should be wearing my hijab. And so it was by choice. So this kind of, taking this dress code and abiding by it I would say, by choice, you're going through that road. So what do you think about, just thinking again back, my mother she never wore hijab, and so was my aunts and the previous generation. And my daughters, I never forced any of them to wear hijab, so they're not wearing it. And I want them to do it out of conviction, like I did it. So now that I see it in my back home country, that's Egypt, a lot of the young women who wore the hijab, probably because everybody was doing it, they are taking it off. Maybe they will put it back on when they're convinced they should. So I'm thinking that looking at women in the Western society specifically, taking the hijab as sort of like they're going to it intentionally to be discriminated upon. I don't think they're there for that. It's out of true conviction. So.
That's such an interesting observation, and thank you for sharing that. I think that you've summed up a number of the different things that I've heard from the many people that it's been my privilege to speak with during this research. And the events of 9/11, and in Britain, the London bombs in 2005, as in Madrid and Istanbul, did prompt a number of youngish Muslims to find out more about their religion, especially because they were being asked in the playground, they were being asked at work. So a lot of people started to want to find out more so they could give answers to that. There are some young women who started to wear hijab precisely because it was stigmatized. So as a sort of an insurrection against that, they were going to adopt what had been stigmatizing and take pride in it. And we've seen this in all sorts of, there are parallel social movements where we've seen that happen. And again, you might think about parallels with, natural hair for Black is beautiful and so on. So to take something that's stigmatizing and turn it around and take ownership of it. And at the same time, the terrible events of 9/11 and the ongoing sequence of terrible events have led a number of people to look for a spiritual framework. Sometimes with informal religion, sometimes within a mix of things. And the fact that that is often being expressed through the way that people dress is very often about personal conviction. And the form of those convictions may change. So the fact that I've been recently looking at women who had chosen to wear hijab and who've now stopped, they are still people of conviction and people of faith, but they've changed the way that they want to express that and enact that. And it may change again. And that's where my sort of sidebar into thinking about the sociology of religion is really helpful. Because sometimes people will say, I just don't understand, because if a woman can wear hijab some days and not others, or wear it for a few years and then stop, then, doesn't that mean it was inauthentic? And I would always say, no, we are contradictory beings, and we express ourselves in different ways. My family kept kosher in some ways and not in others. I thought that was totally normal. Lots of other people did the same. Or you might be part of a very ultra-Orthodox community which is constantly finding more ways of being ultra-Orthodox and expressing it down to the finest detail. That's the other side of that expression. I think that for all of us, the way that we dress is context-specific, and this is why I always want to argue for a historicized understanding. At one point, women wearing trousers in the West was absolutely shocking. Now it's not. There's nothing insurrectionary about wearing trousers. So we are all context-specific, and it's not just about the way that we understand ourselves now. I mean, the context in Egypt is also very interesting. So there's been an increase in head covering, and that's happening for a number of reasons. But one of the things that happened during the global Islamic revival and the growth of the Muslim Brotherhood and other piety movements was that women in urban Egypt, who in the 1920s and 30s and the turn of the previous century had stopped covering their hair and had removed their pechet, their face veils, were being represented as if they were secular. They didn't understand themselves as secular. They were simply modernizing, but they were still pious. They were still leading largely gender-segregated lives. But once you get an increase in veiling as the authentic expression and the only expression, if you want to pose it that way, then you look at pictures of grandmothers and aunts, and they look as if they weren't pious. But actually, that's not how they understood themselves. So it's quite hard for us all to see ourselves in our historical present and think, what this is going to look like in the past and in the future. So I would never take away the personal conviction that is behind many people's choosing to cover. And also I think that those things change over the course of a life. So I certainly wouldn't say, oh, everyone's going to uncover and stop covering. But they might do it in different ways. And certainly the way that women cover will change. You know, I look back at pictures of myself in the 80s and I think, what was I wearing? You know, and people are going to be looking back in 30 years' time and thinking, I wore my hijab like that. Of course, that's what's going to happen too.
I just wanted to add one thing is that I keep telling myself whether someone is taking off their hijab or wearing their hijab, the most important thing for us as a society, whether it's here or back home in Egypt or any other place, is that we have to stop being judgmental. That's the most important thing.
And what you've put your finger on again there is that a number of the young women I've spoken to in Britain, so women who were in their sort of mid-20s, early 30s, whose mother didn't wear hijab, or maybe wore it more in a different way, more casually, would say that once I started wearing hijab, one woman said to me, it was great. I got on the bus and a sister turned around, another Muslim woman, and said, Salam alaikum. I was like, great, she knows I'm Muslim. She wouldn't have known that last week when I wasn't wearing it. But also at the same time, you get immediately more scrutiny. You know, oh, sister, your hair's showing slightly. Or did you think about doing it like this? Or maybe you should be wearing a jilbab. So it cuts both ways as well. So the judgment is incredibly important. And one of the characteristics of the modest fashion movement is a real commitment to respecting choice and trying not to judge. And that's often very challenging. And I'm so impressed with how hard women of all different faith and secular backgrounds try to allow for those differences. Do we have time for one more? Or do
We have
finish?
time for one or two more questions.
Question here.
Why don't I take two questions at the same time in sequence, and they might match up a little bit. Somebody there and somebody here at the front, I
You
think.
do yours first over there, Lee, and then we might have a student question over here. I'm trying to
Okay,
coerce
and
one
we've
out
got
of
one
them.
down the front here. We'll squeeze in three. Ask them fast.
Great, thank you. I'm wondering what you think about the reaction in France, the imposition of a state action against female Muslim clothing has had on that expression by female Muslims in France.
Okay. I can do France in about 2 seconds flat. That's great.
And the students say their question was about the burkini ban,
Okay,
too.
go ahead,
So
ask your
I
question.
think it's along the same lines of the
Okay, do you
state
want to put,
imposing.
where are the students? Please frame your question. Do you want to say what it was?
I just wanted to know if you think that the burkini is part of a fashion field, or is it like a clearly political provocation?
Ah, okay, cool. And gentleman at the front here.
Yeah, mine's a little bit different. It's in a historical nature. Is I noticed when you showed the picture of King Faisal, his headgear looked very similar to what we would have seen as nuns wearing when we were younger. And as you look at the three major religions that came out of the same area, was there like an environmental or climate reasons why this style of clothing developed?
Oh, okay. I'm going to take that one first. I don't know if it was a climate reason, but there are lots of similarities. And one of the points that I make in some of my previous works is that head covering, veiling, that is now often associated with Islam, with Muslims, is pre-Islamic in origin and was common to many different religious and ethnic cultures and communities within the Middle East. And it was often more of an urban phenomenon than a rural phenomenon, and it often was more to do with social status than a sign of piety. So working women, enslaved women, servant women would probably be moving all around the city doing all sorts of stuff because they needed to work, whereas elite women of different communities were more likely to be segregated and living in gender-segregated spaces. So, you know, Druze women, some of them still cover their heads. Christian women, Jewish women in the 18th, 19th centuries also covered their heads in different ways. So again, there are a lot of regional commonalities. Whether it's specifically to do with climate, I don't know. But again, you will also find in different parts of the world that there are shared dress practices. So if you go to India, for example, Muslims and Hindu men and women might still be wearing the shalwar kameez, the tunic and trouser combination, but there might be fine distinctions, for example, in where the trimming lies or so on. So that's a really interesting question, but I don't know if there's a sort of a physical environmental argument behind it. Coming to France, I would say that as with the ban on burkinis, as with Sarkozy's ban on the niqab, this is mainly about French politicians trying to gain leverage in election campaigns than about a real concern for liberating Muslim women. Of course, France is a secular republic, so I think we also have to think about the context of the state, the nation state there, and also different versions of secularity. So the secularity in France is very Catholic inflected. English people who go on holiday to France are constantly saying, we went to the local village to buy bread and everything was closed because it was a saint's day. Because, you know, it's Catholic, so the British Protestant cultural people don't know about all the millions of saints' days, so they're forever losing out on buying bread. I think, and all the French people are like, of course it's closed, it's so-and-so's day in the secular republic. I think that if you are genuinely concerned, I mean, not you, if the state is genuinely concerned that Muslim women are somehow being oppressed and forced to wear bikinis or burqas, then criminalizing their community is not the way to help liberate them. It's not really about talking to women's groups. It's not really about a ground-up thing. It's about politicizing and engineering and the growing power of the right wing. And that is very alarming. I think that, is the burkini a fashion statement or a political provocation? The so-called burkini, the all-in-one or the two-piece but fully covered swimsuit, I mean, actually arose in Australia to provide cover for women and also to help. It was taken up by one of the first Muslim women lifeguards there. So it's a really interesting story about multi-ethnicity and inclusion. It's a completely unenforceable ban, as has been very clearly pointed out. You know, I'm not Muslim. I might turn up wearing, you know, palazzo pants and a tunic because I don't want to put my skin in the sun and my Sophia Loren headscarf. Am I going to be arrested? People wearing wetsuits, children wearing those all-in-one UV protection swimsuits. So again, it is, you know, Muslims in France were killed in the attack in Cannes. In Cannes? Yes, on the waterfront. Muslims in America, Muslims in Britain, Muslims everywhere are just as much at risk as any other section of the population. So I find this very unhelpful. And I think the other thing, as with the ban on burqas, you know, 5 people and their dog are wearing a burqa in France. It's not really a common practice. So it's creating a moral panic about something that isn't actually a big story. It's not demographically significant. But what it does as well is it keeps putting other members of the Muslim populations, the Muslim communities, on the back foot in having to defend the right of those who want to wear a burqa to be able to wear a burqa or a niqab, a face veil. And many of those Muslims don't think it's essential or even desirable, and certainly not required, but they do need to defend the right of co-religionists to do what they want. So again, it really doesn't help build that sort of community, respect and cohesion and finding a way through difference. And these scare stories are just going to keep coming.
Thank you so much. And that's...
Thank you very much indeed.